Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla, and this is Freddy Goes to Florida, Chapter 18. Nothing much happened, however, for the next few days. They plodded along the road, doing a steady 25 miles a day, for they were used to it now and could go much longer without getting tired than when they had first set out. Most of the people they met had heard about them by this time, and although they attracted a good deal of attention, nobody molested them. The heap of gold coins lay in the bottom of the phaeton, but they had covered it up with an old shawl so that no one knew that anything was there. At last, one morning, they came to the bridge where the animals had found Mr. and Mrs. Webb again after they had fallen into the river. The two spiders were very much excited, and Mrs. Webb ran up to the tip of Mr. Wiggins' left horn, and Mr. Webb ran up to the tip of her right horn, and they sat there and looked out across the landscape and shouted to each other, "Oh, do you remember this?" and "Oh, do you remember that?" until Mrs. Webb was so overcome by the recollection of their strange adventure that she burst into tears. Then Mr. Webb climbed hurriedly down from Mrs. Wiggins' right horn and climbed up her left horn and patted his wife clumsily on the back with one of his 8 feet, which he could also use as hands. And he said, there, Emmeline, don't cry." And Mrs. Webb wiped her eyes with the tiny pocket handkerchief which she had woven herself, and she stopped crying. The animals went on across the bridge and through the village, and when they were out in the country again, Jack said, "I think, if nobody minds, I'd better ride in the carriage for a while. We're getting near where I used to live, and I don't want the man I used to live with to see me. It might cause trouble." Mrs. Wiggins gave a chuckle. "I have to laugh every time I think of that man and the way he bounced like a rubber ball on the top of his automobile when I tossed him up there. He was an awful coward, even if he did have a big black mustache." "Yes," said Jack, as he climbed into the phaeton and crouched down under the shawl. "But just the same, I think we'd better hurry along. He has a bad disposition, and he would take a lot of trouble to get even with us for the things that we did to him." "We mustn't take any chances with all of this money," said Henrietta. So they hurried along, and pretty soon they passed the road which led up to the farm where the man with the black mustache lived, and that a little later they passed the swimming hole in the river where Mrs. Wiggins had fallen in. "We ought to be pretty safe now," said Jack, "because he doesn't often come up this way in his automobile, but I'll stay here for a little while longer just the same." In another mile or two, the road, which had been running across a valley, began to climb a long hill. It was getting along into the afternoon now, and as the animals had been walking fast, they were hot and dusty. So they were all glad when they came to a stream that crossed the road part way up the hill. They decided to take a swim. "I remember this place," said Robert. "We stopped here to take a swim the day we started out, just before we met the man with the black mustache the first time." Yes, we did," exclaimed the other animals. "Why, we are almost home. If we go on now, we can get back to Mr. Bean's before midnight." Some of them were all for going on at once when they realized how close home was. But Charles says, "We don't want to get there at night when Mr. Bean and Mrs. Bean and all of the other animals asleep. That won't be any fun." And Freddy said, "We'll be so tired when we get there that we won't want to tell them about our travels, and they'll be so sleepy that they won't want to hear about them. I vote we camp here tonight and go on in the morning. We'll get home about dinner time." "That sounds sensible," said Hank. "We've come a long way today. If you ask me, I've had about enough. It's all right for you other animals, but I have to pull this carriage, and all that gold is heavier than Mr. and Mrs. Bean put together." So they pulled the carriage under a tree, and pretty soon they were all splashing about in the water, which was pretty cold, for it was still early in the spring. But animals, with the exception of cats, do not mind cold water as much as some people do. Now they were so near home and so sure that nothing would interfere with their getting there that they did not keep a very good watch while they were in swimming. And they did not see a pair of sharp eyes that were watching them from the bushes. nor hear the rustle of leaves as the bushes parted and the dirty-faced boy, who was the son of the man with the black mustache, sneaked over to the carriage and, lifting a corner of the shawl that covered the heap of gold coins, peeked under it. When they came back out of the water and ran up and down the bank to dry themselves, the boy had gone. They did not sit up very late that night, for they were all pretty tired. Before they went to bed, Robert and Charles and Jack wound and set the alarm clock. They had done this every night since Aunt Etta had given it to them, and this was the way that they did it. Jack held the clock in his mouth, and Robert took hold of the winder with his teeth, and they twisted. Sometimes it took them half an hour to do it, but they always did it. And when the clock part was wound up, they wound the alarm. But the thing you set the alarm with to make it go off at a certain time in the morning was so small that neither Jack nor Robert could get hold of it properly. And so, when they had got it all wound up, Charles would take hold of the thing with his beak and set it for whatever time they wanted to get up. This time they set it for 5 o'clock because they wanted to get an early start. They all took turns standing watch over the gold at night, and tonight it was Charles and Henrietta's turn. The other animals had found a warm and comfortable place to sleep under the little bridge beside the stream, and when all the good nights had been said, the rooster and his wife made a final round of the camp to see if all was in order, and they flew up into the phaeton, perched on the back of the front seat, and tucked their head under their wings. They had not been asleep long when it began to rain. It rained gently at first, and Charles, half awakened, moved about a little on his perch and then dropped off again, lulled by the monotonous patter of the umbrella-like roof of the carriage. But the patter grew to a rattle, and then to a roar, and he awoke again to find his feathers getting wetter and wetter, and Henrietta tapping him crossly on the shoulder with her beak. "Come, come, Charles, wake up," she was saying. "We'll get wet and catch our deaths, very likely." "This will never do," said Charles. "We can't stay here. I think, my dear, we had better join the others under the bridge." "I think we had better do nothing of the kind," said Henrietta crossly. "We are here to watch the gold, and here we stay. We can get down under the shawl in the back seat and keep dry. Come along." "But the mice are sleeping here tonight," Charles protested, "and you know how Eenie snores." "I shouldn't sleep a wink." But Henrietta was not listening. She had jumped down onto the wagon seat, and Charles followed her, repeating, "I shan't sleep a wink." "Not a wink." But once they had gotten under the shawl, where it was nice and warm and dry, and had pushed the sleepy mice over to make a little room, he did fall asleep again with great promptness. It was true that Eenie snored, although it was not a very loud snore, for Eenie was a very small mouse. And then Cousin Augustus had the nightmare and dreamed that 4 tortoise-shell cats with red eyes were chasing him, baying like the bloodhounds in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which he had once seen when he had been on a visit to his aunt, who lived in a town hall at Joy Center near Mr. Bean's farm. Cousin Augustus squeaked dreadfully when he had had the nightmare, which was as often as he ate too much supper, and that was as often as he could, and he jerked his legs and moaned and lashed his tail so that Eek and Quick and Eenie had to get up and shake him awake. But even through all of this, Charles would have slept peacefully on if Henrietta had not pecked him on the neck and said, "Charles, wake up. You'll have to do something about these mice. Keeping it up at all hours. I've never heard of such a racket. They don't seem to have any regard for anyone." So Charles took his head out from under his wing. He couldn't see anything because he was under the shawl, but he could hear Cousin Augustus waking up and then saying, oh dear me, such a dream, such a dream." "Here, here," said Charles sleepily and trying to be stern. "What's all of this? Do be still, can't you? Other people want to sleep, even if you don't." "Cousin Augustus has had a nightmare," said Eek. "It's all over now." Charles was satisfied with this and would have put his head back under his wing, but Henrietta pecked him again. So he said gruffly, "Well, we can't have that. Do you understand? We can't have it. We cannot have our rest broken in this way. I think you mice had better go and sleep somewhere else, as you don't seem to be able to do it quietly like other animals." The mice were a little afraid of Charles because he was so grand and talked so beautifully and strutted about the barnyard so nobly, and so they did not give him any back talk, but climbed down meekly out of the carriage and went to join the other animals under the bridge. "Well, for once you had the gumption to stand up to somebody, even if it was only a mouse," said Henrietta. But Charles did not hear her, for he was again fast asleep. There was now no sound under the shawl but the ticking of the alarm clock and Charles's gentle breathing, and so Henrietta went to sleep again too. When she woke again, it was still dark. For a few minutes she could not tell what it was that had roused her, and then she heard a faint creak, and the carriage gave a lurch to one side. It was moving. Something or somebody was drawing the carriage down the road. She pecked Charles sharply, and he awoke with a groan. "Oh, my goodness, Henrietta, what is it now? Can't you leave me alone?" "Hush!" she whispered. "Don't you feel the carriage moving? Someone is running away with it. Someone is stealing the gold." Charles was very awake. In an instant, he poked his head out from underneath the shawl and looked about him. Two shadowy forms, men they looked like, though they might be animals, were pulling the carriage down the hill, and they must have pulled it some distance from where Hank had left it, for the bridge was nowhere in sight. "This comes of not keeping watch," whispered Henrietta, who had poked her head out beside him. "If you hadn't crawled underneath this shawl, you'd have been able to hear what was going on." "You crawled under it too," said Charles. "You're as much to blame as I am. But what shall we do? Even if I crow my loudest, they'll never hear me with the rain coming down the way it is." "One of us must jump out and run back and give the alarm," said Henrietta, "and the other one must stay here and find out where the carriage is being taken. You better go, Charles, and I'll stay." Charles was too scared to complain at being ordered to go out in the heavy rain. The only thing he wanted was to get away from that carriage as quickly as possible, and being scared, he did what a scared rooster always does. He gave a loud squawk, and then he made a wild jump for the road. But his feet caught in the fringe of the shawl, and before he could get them free, and before Henrietta could get out herself, one of the dark figures dropped the handle of the carriage at which it was pulling, ran back, and caught them both. It was the dirty-faced boy. "Hey, Pa," he called, "here's a couple of nice chickens for Sunday dinner in here, with the money." They squawked and struggled, but he held on tight. And then the man with the black mustache came and tied their feet with string and shoved them roughly into the space under the front seat of the phaeton. "I hope you're satisfied," said Henrietta. "Of all the useless, good-for-nothing roosters, you're the worst. Why couldn't you keep your silly beak shut? My goodness, you certainly have gotten us into a nice mess now." And she went on telling just what she thought of him. But Charles was not listening. Sunday dinner, he was thinking. Sunday dinner. Me, that's traveled hundreds and thousands of miles in my time. Me, that's seen what I've seen and done what I've done, to end a Sunday dinner? Fricasseed, probably, and eaten by perfect strangers. And he burst into tears. And this is Grandma Carla. What are they going to do to get out of this mess? I love you.